Okay, Auto 171 guys, listen, I apologize. I want to break these up into 12 to 15 minute videos just because it's easier for me to upload. Runs a little quicker on the upload side, so I'm going to take a break and then we're back. So this is the second in the manual transmission video series. We're on page 110 of the manual transmission book. So basically, where we left off, we talked about the components of a synchronizer assembly. We talked about the hub, we talked about the sleeve, we talked about the speed gear and teeth, and we talked about obviously the blocker assembly, sometimes referred to as a synchronizer ring. But so you've got those basic components. Where I left off is talking about this assembly here. Now this is a very simplified version of a selector assembly. This right here would be inside the vehicle, obviously the shifter in the center of the floor. This particular illustration shows how this is linked to 3 shift rails. Now these 3 shift rails control independently these 3 shift forks. These forks are on different rails. The shifter itself will pivot left to right in a ball and socket. Pushing the shifter to the right will engage the rail closest to myself. Leaving the shifter in the center would engage the center rail. Pushing the shifter to the left would engage the rail to the right and operate the corresponding forks. And with the forks spline 2 of the sleeves, and the sleeves slide obviously over the speed gear, just as we talked about. So you have a shifter assembly that's in the vehicle. This item right here is sometimes referred to as the selector assembly. These 3 poles would be considered rails. So you got 3 shift rails, and then these are the forks. The forks themselves will slide over the sleeve in this slot. On the fork itself, there's a wear patch, usually some sort of bearing style material, because you gotta remember the sleeve is rotating at the speed of the hub and the speed of the shaft. So it has to slide on something. This particular patch can be a serviceable piece, could be something you can order. Sometimes there's a little plastic feet that you put on there. Sometimes there are little metallic pucks that engage with clips, but there's going to be some sort of wear portion on there. So that's kind of what that does. A little bit back to the shifter. I want to talk about the shifter itself. If you get in a manual transmission vehicle and basically release the shifter, put it in what they call neutral, which is the center position, this should spring straight up and down. Okay, in the center, what they call a center gate. Moving the shifter left to right towards the driver's side, towards the passenger side, back and forth. That is called a crossover movement. So taking the shifter and pushing it left, pushing it right, that's going to be a crossover movement. Moving it forward and aft, actually pushing the rails forward and back, that's called the selector movement. So there's really 2 movements in a shifter. If you look at your typical shifter gate, you're going to have basically a pattern, the H pattern they call it. It looks something like this. This may be first gear, this may be second gear, this may be third gear, this may be 4th gear. If it's a 5-speed, this is probably going to be 5th gear, and sometimes directly below 5th gear would be reverse. Sometimes it's a slightly different corresponding. Sometimes they put reverse over here, reverse down here, and there's many different shifting patterns. But the movement back and forth of the shifter across the gate pattern, this movement back and forth, is called the crossover. This movement is the selector movement. It's 2 different movements, so left to right and forward and aft. Sometimes there's 2 different cables, one cable to move the shifter back and forth, another cable to move the shifter back and this way. This would be the crossover cable. This is the selector cable. Sometimes it's a rod, and the rod will be rotated left to right like this. And it would pivot back and forth inside the transmission, being the crossover movement, and then the fore and aft movement would actually be considered the selector movement. So again, that's a little bit of an introduction to this. They do talk about detents. We're going to get into detents a little bit later, but what a detent does is it gives you that positive feel when you slide the shifter into gear. Once you've engaged the gear, the shift rail, you want it to stay there. You want the shifter to actually stay in that position. So if you push it up in first, you don't want to pop it back into the neutral gate. So what'll happen is you'll push the vehicle into gear. Once it goes into gear, the detent will drop into a little ball. The ball and spring will drop into a little groove on the rail, giving you a little bit of positive feel, meaning it's staying in gear, kind of holds you in gear. That's called a detent. Sometimes there'll be assemblies within the rails called interlocks. And what an interlock or an interlock plunger will do, will be doing something similar, I guess, to a detent. But what an interlock does is an interlock prevents two rails from moving at the same time. If one rail moves and the other rail moves, maybe you haven't moved it all the way over and got into the proper gate, maybe you're kind of halfway between two gates and you try to move forward, you may actually be pushing two rails at the same time. An interlock prevents the two rails from moving. So even if you got in there, try to push it, and you notice the shifter doesn't move, you got to actually bring it into the full alignment of the gate, push it forward, and that'll push just one rail forward. Again, the interlock may actually cause that to do that. So, all right, other things you need to know, and as the assembly's built up, this is a really good picture. As the assembly's built up, you'll see the sleeve and obviously the hubs underneath it, and then you got your blocker ring, you got your speed gear. There's going to be a natural gap between the speed gear, or in this case, the illustration says gear T clutch, gear clutch teeth, or in this speed gear, it'll be a natural gap between this and the blocker ring assembly. Now let me see if I can show that to you. This is actually a pretty good video or visual. You'll see that the blocker ring goes over the speed gear. Now when I set this down and I kind of push down on it, you're going to notice there's a gap right here. See this gap right here? You can actually measure that with a feeler gauge. It's going to be 35, 40 thousand, something like that. So if you put your blocker ring over the top of that, you're going to see there's a gap. As this clutch material wears on the blocker ring, that's going to get closer. Okay, so this is actually going to move in that direction. So what happens is this gap actually gets closer, gets thinner. If that's the case, and it's under specification, that means this blocker ring is worn out, it must be replaced. So one of the procedures you'll do after you assemble either an automatic